So I'm going to start with this story of the humpback whale. Some of you have heard this before, but I thought this was fascinating when I was watching this with my son on National Geographic one day, and it was about the humpback whale's hunting strategy. The fact that they will hunt in packs, they will see a group of herring, and what they'll do is they'll circle the herring, and they'll circle the herring enough times to create sort of a wave or a bubble around them. They'll back away and they'll start blowing bubbles and making noises. So what happens is the herring start to panic and they all huddle up together. And around them are the humpback whales, right, blowing bubbles, making noises, and all they see though is a veil, like a wall of bubbles. And so because of the fear of what's going on and the confusion, the thinking of the herring is if we stay together, we'll be safe, right? And one at a time, the humpback whale goes from underneath, mouth open, swallowing up like hundreds of the herring, right? So I remember watching that thinking, wow, that's kind of a fascinating way to hunt. But I was looking at it from the perspective of the herring. And I thought, isn't that fascinating? Because the announcer was saying how if only the herring knew that the actual place of safety was to go towards the bubbles and not stay in the middle and not to huddle up, then there's nothing on the other side. Like they're so far away that when you swim through the bubbles, that's where you're free. And so I thought about that, and of course, every time I'm consuming any kind of information, anytime I see a post on social media or I watch a show, I'm always thinking that was probably relevant for something for me that I can use somewhere in my life. And I thought about that veil, and I thought about the herring, and I thought that's actually not far off from how we get overwhelmed. How we, when it comes to health, get inundated with information to the point that we get overwhelmed with not really knowing, like, what do we do? 1 minute, a study is going to say that drinking coffee is good for you because it will reduce your chances of a certain kind of disease. 3 weeks later, a month later, well, if you drink this much coffee, it actually causes this kind of disease. So you can see how in today's day and age, there's so much fear, worry, and anxiety around our health. And it's coming at us from all angles. It's no longer just the TV. Now we're carrying it in our phones, in our pockets, right? You can't go through a social media post or some sort of news feed without reading something that's related to your health. More than likely, it's going to create a fear. And so what I'm hoping is to look at what's actually my perspective of my experience in the last 17 years almost of a practice as a chiropractor, the previous, 10 years or so before that as a student of psychology and kinesiology, and really my entire life of observing human behavior. And I'm hoping to be able to share with you tonight some of the key points that you can maybe look at your own life differently so that you can start living in a way that hopefully is going to bring greater health and, as we're going to find out, happiness in your life moving forward. All right? So the first thing, this is right here, the map of Italy. There's a small little town there. I think it's Valfertore. It's like the province of Foggia or something. And there's a town there called Roseto. And this town, the immigrants that immigrated to the U.S. from that town moved into Pennsylvania and pretty much created a similar town in Pennsylvania. And what was unique about this town that they also called Rossetto, so it's in Roseto, Pennsylvania, is that in the 1960s, 1950s, there was a doctor that was treating patients in this town, and he met up with a speaker, this gentleman, Stuart Wolf, who was traveling around as a medical doctor presenting at conferences, but he had, I think, a summer home somewhere near this town, and he met up for drinks after a conference with this doctor, and the doctor said to Stuart Wolf, it's interesting, the town where I work, the people that live there, nobody under the age of 60 is dying of a heart attack. There's no heart disease in this town. And so Stuart Wolf was intrigued because that's impossible. This is the 1950s in America. The number one killer of anybody younger than 60 was a heart attack. There was no cholesterol lowering medication. There was none of that. Like, what do you mean no one's dying of a heart attack? So they investigated. So he brought a colleague, John Brunn. They brought sociology, health students, medical students, combed through all the health records of this town, and they hypothesized that, well, there's really three possibilities of why these people have zero heart disease. Not just no heart disease, no ulcers, no suicides, no depression. So there's three possibilities. Maybe it's genetic, that they just happen to come from this very hardy gene pool of residents in this town of Roseto in Italy, and that's why they're not getting heart disease. And when they looked at all the other records of other people from Roseto in other parts of America, they actually had the same heart disease rates as everywhere else. So it wasn't genetics. And then they thought, well, if it's not genetics, maybe it's the diet. Like, we're so good at, making it about the diet. It must be what's keeping them healthy. So then they said, well, they have a Mediterranean Italian diet. They must be eating very healthy with the olive oils and all the fresh foods, right? And when they looked at their diet, actually that wasn't the case. They had adopted a very American diet. They weren't using olive oil. That was too expensive. They were using lard. They weren't, having pizzas with just cheese, sauce, and some anchovies. They were actually having pizzas with ham and bacon and pepperoni. And the treats that were coming out only once or twice a year in Italy were now being eaten in this town year round. Not only that, most of them were smokers. Most of them were overweight. Nobody was taking care of their health or exercising. So it couldn't be diet that helped them to have a zero heart disease. So then they thought it's got to be something in the environment. Maybe it's the soil or the water of this town. So they compared that water and soil and their health records with those in neighboring towns that shared the same water and soil. And again, it was not conclusive. No, these people use the same soil and water in the neighboring town of Bangor, but they don't have protection from heart disease the way this town of Roseto does. And so after all that research, they actually came up with what they considered the Roseto Effect. And if you Google it, there's a bunch of journals written about this, right, in the 1960s. And it's this idea that what protected them, right, John Wolfe and Stuart Wolfe and John Brunn concluded, was the power of the clan. It was the community that they created in this small town. Everything was insulated from the rest of the country. They spoke the dialect of what they spoke in Italy. Every relationship, the marriages stayed within the relatives or the people that they knew. It was a very supportive community where if you were hard up and you lost your job, we made sure nobody else had to know and we pitched in. And so there was this idea that we were taking care of each other. There were three families, three generations living under one roof. The grandparents had the say of like how things work, and they established a sort of order in how this town worked. So the church was the foundation. The community associations was what kept everybody connected in a community setting. And what they concluded was it was this power of the clan that protected them from heart disease. And they predicted that once these kids get older and they start moving to outside neighborhoods, they start getting jobs in the city, they start marrying outside of the community, you're going to see changes in their health. And they were absolutely correct. The first person to die of a heart attack was in the 1970s in that town. As the urbanization took over, as things started to change. Okay, so this is just important because this was done in the 60s. And there's still a lot of research about it. I heard about it in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. It was actually talked about as his introduction in that book. And it's intriguing because it shows you in the 60s, there was already evidence to show that diet, genetic predisposition, and environmental conditions did not prevent or determine somebody's ability to be protected from heart disease or heart attack. Okay? So just remember that, important that it was the community that mattered. Now, we go to this, the Harvard Study of Adult Development. So this is pretty much the longest study that's been conducted on happiness, health, and longevity. Okay? 75, 80 years, something like that. Robert Waldinger, he's the last doctor to, he's currently the doctor that was overseeing the project. So this started in the 30s. It started in a small town in Boston, and then it expanded. They followed these people for the last 80 years. Okay, and again, if you look up Dr. Robert Waldinger, you're going to find a very famous TED Talk that he did a couple of years ago, and it was on what makes a good life. Lessons from the longest study on happiness and health. Okay, so you can look that up. You can listen to Robert Waldinger's information from that research. But ultimately, after all of this compilation of information, they compiled everything, they looked at all the records, they followed these people when they were teenagers, when they were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, then their wives, then their grandkids, right? The greatest predictor of health and happiness and longevity was good, stable, quality relationships. Good, stable, quality relationships was the thing that was going to help you to stay healthiest and happiest. Okay, so it wasn't diet, it wasn't your exercise or lifestyle, it wasn't your genetics, it wasn't your environment, it was do you have in your life good, stable, quality relationships, which means, doesn't mean you don't fight, doesn't mean there's no arguing, it meant that you knew that regardless of how long or how much you argued or how long you saw that person, that when things got rough, there was a group of people you can rely on. There was somebody that was there for you that you could count on, that had your back. So that's sort of an interesting thing, because it didn't matter whether you were married or not, because you could be in a very difficult marriage that you know that this person, even though we're partners, does not have my back. That was not the case. The case here is that it's somebody that when things get rough, you intrinsically know, I have people I can count on. And that's what was the greatest predictor of health. To the point that they interviewed them at 50. By looking at how they answered the quality of their relationships, they could predict who was going to be healthy and happy at 80 based on what they answered at 50. Okay, so again, important to think about when you look at health, longevity, and happiness, when we're really being sold right now on how you need to eat, what lifestyle you need to do, how much you need to meditate, how much you need to exercise, how much you need to go for walks, how much you need to be more mindful. Like, there's a lot of stuff we're being told. Again, right? Just like the bubbles, we're getting confused. Like, what should I do? And yet, there's just two examples that really tell us, well, number one, the community is going to matter. So pay attention to the community of people that you're around. And number two, your relationships are going to matter. So who are you connected with? Do you have people that you can count on when things don't go the way you expect them to go? All right? And then we have this guy named Dr. Hammer, who in the 80s decides he's going to brain scan all his patients. And, you know, it wasn't new that having an unexpected shock was going to cause a potential disease diagnosis, but nobody had ever looked in the brain. And so by brain scanning all his patients, he was able to map out specifically which regions on the brain had an impact, known as a hammer focus, and what symptoms those people, 100% of them with that hammer focus in a particular area, what symptoms they were having. So again, it was verifiable, it was predictable. Not only that, he took it a step further. He started to recognize that how we all perceive subconsciously and subjectively in a split second an unexpected event known as a conflict shock will determine what part of the brain gets that impact, which will then determine what biological program is going to run in that person's body that will show up as the symptom that we will experience. So Dr. Hammer's research came to be known as the New Medicine, also known as GNM or German New Medicine. And again, he gave us what really is a revolutionary finding of the 5 biological laws, right? This year, we sort of went through all 5 individually, right? That unexpected shock that you subconsciously and subjectively perceive determines where it goes in the brain, what symptoms you're going to get. The second biological law, that there's 2 phases that you run in or that you're running once you have a biological conflict shock. You're in the conflict active phase where you're stressed, but there's not a lot of symptoms happening. And then there's the healing phase where there's lots of swelling, inflammation, pain, discharge, the rash. All of that often shows up in the healing phase. And so, understanding that all of this, according to the third biological law, is based on the study of the science of embryology and human evolution. The fourth biological law, that microbes play a significant role in the repair and the restoration process of the organs and tissues. And the fifth biological law, that every so-called disease is actually a significant biological special program inherent in all organisms to assist that organism by creating extra cells or by ulcerating and widening tissues or by changing the function of certain tissues during a time of emotional distress. Okay, so Dr. Hammer really flips the script on what the previous two studies even quantified as what it meant to be sick or what it meant to have heart disease. Okay, because when you understand the two phases, when you understand what's being shared on the learninggnm.com website, you start to look at that town of Rossetto and you realize, like, the reason they didn't have heart disease is because there must not have been a lot of territorial losses in that town. Why not? Because there was no demarcation of territory. If we are one community, then what's mine is yours. You need something, here you go. There is no, this is my property, get off my stuff. This is my stuff, give it back. That didn't exist, which meant there was very little, if any, territorial conflicts in that town, which maybe explains why there was not a lot of coronary artery programs that could have led to heart attacks. So you see how Dr. Hammer's research will help us to rewrite a lot of the previous research when it comes to health that maybe we never looked at in this way. Why would we look at someone's territory and losing something that belonged in their territory as related to a heart attack? We wouldn't prior to Dr. Hammer's research in the 1980s. But I hope that those of you here, those of you tuning in, are going to start looking at your psyche and how you're perceiving these things starting now. All right? In the end, Dr. Hammer's research tells us that our symptoms don't mean what we thought it meant. It means that your body's trying to give you a sign that it needs your help. Not that there's something wrong. It means that there's something that was bothering you, something that caught you off guard, something that was emotionally distressing, and that you need to identify it, be conscious of it, and resolve it. And that sort of gives way to, my contribution to this, what I call the ABCs of symptom relief, right? Being aware of the conflict that's tied to your symptoms, regardless of the symptom, whether it's anxiety, whether it's palpitation, rash, neck pain, stomach issues, digestive issues. When did it start, and what was the unexpected event or conflict shock you must have experienced at that time? Identify it. Then the B, how do you break away from your old pattern of thinking? How do you break away from what you've been told is the cause of that symptom? If it's a rash, you have to break away from thinking it's something you ate. It's something you came into contact with in a chemical or something in your environment. You see how that's not easy, but that's part of the process of getting to overcoming your symptoms. I'm aware of what this is about. It was that divorce, not the chemicals or the food. I'm now going to break away from relating it to anything else but that nasty and unexpected divorce, and then see how do you change your perspective of that nasty divorce. And again, I just did a video on this recently where people are always saying, like, I can't find my conflict shock. I don't know how, it's hard to find it. The reality is, guys, finding the conflict shock is not the hardest thing. The hardest thing is once you find it, how are you going to resolve it? That's the real challenge. How are you going to change your perspective of that circumstance, that situation, or that person and what they did to you? That's the challenge. All right? And so I hope that by knowing this, by now thinking differently about your symptom, by now being immersed into the science of GNM, you're going to start looking at your health a little bit differently. Number one, I'm hoping that you don't panic the way you used to when you get a symptom, right? Because most symptoms happen in the healing phase. It's important to look at, where did this come from? What did I just resolve? What was going on in my life, right? And number two, recognize that you have more control than you think. That ultimately, you have the ability to change your perspective about anything. And so I want you to start to really recognize how in this coming year, as I move forward, how am I going to be able to do this better? How am I going to have more confidence in my ability to resolve my conflicts so my symptoms can improve? All right? And again, it came up today, you know, the idea that we're looking at prevention, because you're not really going to be able to prevent your symptoms from showing up. Having said that, there is one way. One way you can prevent a symptom from showing up. What do you guys think it is? What's the one thing you can do if you do not want to have that symptom show up? How can you prevent it from showing up?
Don't resolve the issue.
Perfect! See, you guys are awesome. The answer, do not resolve the conflict. It's a pretty straightforward thing, but you see how that goes counter to how we've been trained. What do you mean, don't resolve it? What do you mean, stay angry at what they did to me? What do you mean, not clear it and forgive them? And when you know G&M and you understand that this has been a long-standing anger, separation, abandonment for 20, 30, 40 years, and it's intense. If you never resolve that, then you probably will never get symptoms related to that. So that's the one way. Otherwise, the chances of you in your day-to-day life experiencing something unexpected, it's going to happen. So we have to really shift away from this idea that, like, well, if I learn this, I'm going to be healthy and I'm not going to get sick. That's not easy to shift from that, because I know many of you started out here, many of you are tuning in, many of you have seen me here because that was your objective. I want to learn this so I don't get sick. I want to learn this so that I never have to deal with pain. I never have to. But you see how the deeper you go into it, you start to realize, like, is that even possible? When I don't even know when something unexpected is going to happen tomorrow or next month. Who am I kidding? And that's where, again, it takes a level of true understanding. It takes a level of emotional maturity to be able to be comfortable with that. And I get it. It's not everyone's ready for that, right? We all kind of want the quick fix and not have to feel the pain. And we all don't want to have to dig up how we're feeling about certain things that are going on. It's kind of messy. I don't want to think about that. I get it because I hear it all the time here. And my thing in the last 10 years of now truly applying this, teaching it, observing what I've seen, there's really no other way. You could, though, get lucky that inadvertently your life situation changes. And because of that change, you resolve the conflict. And then the symptom goes away. That could happen, right? If your issue is your boss at work who's picking on you, who creates an indigestible anger, you've got digestive issues for many years since that boss started working there, and guess what? One day the boss gets fired. And the new boss that you have, you love this boss. Your symptoms could resolve. My thing is, why wait for that when you realize that you actually have more control than you think? Okay, and that's why a lot of the people, and I get this a lot, where people will tell me, well, you know, so-and-so, you know, that thing that he came to you for, we bought this machine, or we did this technique, or we saw this practitioner, or we went on this cleanse, and guess what? After 6 months, it went away. And so I'm just letting you know, like, he's better, but it's because of all these things that he did. And then, you know, I get it. Like, you know, I'm always like, that's great, first of all, that they're better. But then my answer is, we talked about a conflict that led to that. Did he ever look to see if that conflict got resolved? Because if it did, that's probably why he's better. See, and it's so hard for somebody that gets excited about that, right? About the cleanse, or about this new thing, or about this practitioner. It's so hard to have to break that to somebody like that. Because I get it. Some people now, maybe that's your livelihood. Maybe now you're now a consultant that sells that product, right? But to me, if you don't look at the conflict, if you don't include the psyche in the healing, how do you really know? How do we really know that it was just the fact that they had 3 families living under one roof and the grandmother was in charge, that's why there was no heart disease? How do you know that nobody there had a territorial loss, though, if you didn't ask that question? And why would researchers ask it? Not in the 60s. They didn't even know Dr. Hammer didn't come up with it yet. But today, still, no researcher is asking that question. And that's all I hope. Like, I really hope one day someone's going to watch, these Instagram and YouTube and Facebook videos one day, and they're going to watch all my crazy, facial expressions and what I'm sharing, and they're going to say, you know what, we should study this more. And that would be great. Because I'm not here to tell you, like, I know for sure what this is. I'm just here to share what I experienced, and I hope someone's curious enough to be able to, like, let's dig into this. What's this guy talking about? How could this be? And because no one's looking. And that's why, when I read all these books that I consume information on health, all these great personal growth, spiritual texts that are out there, and it makes me feel almost, in shock that somebody that's so knowledgeable doesn't know this. Like, how could this be? This person's an author that's world-renowned and has all this knowledge about so much stuff, but they don't know what I know? That's hard to believe. And I feel like that all the time. And yet I go back to work, I go back to doing a video, I go back to talking to patients, I go back to seeing case studies, I go back to seeing people getting results that they haven't received in any other capacity. And so I can't go back. And so what I hope is that by doing these presentations, by doing these videos, by posting in this way, there's enough people out there that I don't even know about that's consuming the information, that it stirs up something inside that prompts them to want to test it, that prompts them to want to investigate and to ask more questions. Because that's really where it comes down to. It's the curiosity. Because something else doesn't work. Why didn't we look for this? Why didn't I ever ask my patients when they have a cough if something scared them? Why not? Why didn't I ever ask somebody that had a sore throat, if there was something that they couldn't swallow? If they have diarrhea, there's something that was hard to digest, that was upsetting. And I get it. They wouldn't know because they weren't introduced to GNM. And so this is part of really what I'm doing with this, right? Is that inadvertently, maybe people are being introduced. And I know many of you are already sharing the information. But it's going to take time, like I said, right? Like for you, it may be, it's clear cut. To everyone else that you're going to introduce them to, they're used to what everyone else is really saying. So I get it. You have to recognize that as well, all right, in order not to get frustrated. So what does it come down to? If you want to be healthy moving forward, what we've learned in 80 years, 40 years, the last 70 years of all the research, if you put it all together, it really comes down to community, connections, conflict resolution. And in the end, the common aspect of this is the fact that it all revolves around relationships. That it's not how much you meditate necessarily. It's not how much you're working out. It's not how much kale you're eating, or how much quinoa you're eating, or how much animal meat you're avoiding. It's not how much chemicals in your environment you're getting out of your food. It's what are the quality of your relationships, right? Do you have a pack? Do you have 3 to 5 people that you can count on? Do you have the emotional flexibility to be able to change your mind about the people that create the conflicts for you? And that's really what being healthy moving forward is going to be about.